say, their word, they stand by. And if they're a dad, they will do everything that a dad will do. And of course God is faithful par excellence, because he never changes. He's always doing what God always does best, and that is to love, to pour out himself in loving us. Now this is the first of the signs. It's the great first image we have of what Jesus is like, of what the beloved disciple thinks of when he thinks of Jesus. He thinks of him as our bridegroom, the bridegroom of the human race. Extraordinary image, isn't it? And the church celebrates this, the wedding feast of Cana, and used to in the early days, the feast of the Epiphany. And nowadays we celebrate it close to the Epiphany. But it's one of the major ways when God starts to reveal himself through Jesus. The feast of the Epiphany. Now the second thing we'd like to spend a bit of time on is the clearing or the cleansing of the temple. Raymond Brown suggests that, well, probably there are two incidents which we should distinguish if we're to understand this scene. The first is that Jesus at some stage uttered a prophetic warning against the temple. And probably that was early in his ministry. In the Synoptic Gospels, at Jesus' trial before the Sanhedrin, false witnesses say that Jesus threatened to destroy the temple and to rebuild it again in 3 days. We even hear at the foot of the cross echoes of this as passers-by jeer Jesus. Whereas the episode of the cleansing of the temple probably occurred later in Jesus' ministry. As the Synoptic Gospels have it, not as St. John has it at the beginning. And this makes sense if it's later, because such an action would have demanded some immediate and swift counteraction against Jesus, his arrest or something. And of course, it's only after you've made it as a prophet would you be able to actually do such a prophetic action. And as this occurs in the Synoptic Gospels after Jesus' triumphant entry into Jerusalem. So there it makes greater sense. It's more powerful and it speaks to the people. So why does John, the question would be, place it here at the beginning of Jesus' ministry? A couple of reasons are offered. One is that the ultimate reason for Jesus' arrest in St. John is that he raised Lazarus to life after he died. But also it seems to fit in a little bit with how he sees John the Baptist. Because from Malachi chapter 3 verse 1 we have this: I send my messenger to prepare the way for me, John the Baptist, and the Lord whom you seek will suddenly enter his temple. And Jesus does. Suddenly enters the temple. So the messenger and the Lord are fitted together here. The Baptist, then the cleansing of the temple. But also there's a third reason why John places this early, and it's because immediately we see the great conflict within the gospel between Jesus and the Jewish people. The temple is cleared to make way for something new. Now wherever this happened, it's good to know that people would have understood this prophetically. It wasn't just an event that struck people, what on earth is this about? They would have understood that this prophet is saying something about God's relationship with the temple. In Jeremiah chapter 7 verse 2, it says that the temple has become a den of thieves. In Zechariah 14 verse 21 we read that there shall no longer be merchants in the house of the Lord of hosts when that day comes. And in Isaiah 56 verse 7 we read, my house will be called a house of prayer for all the nations. If you put those together, you have a sense that this cleansing of God's house is going to take place around the time the day of the Lord is happening. And that'll be when the Messiah is with us. And so this prophetic action is telling us something about the times we're living in. In St. John's account of this, which is different from the Synoptics, John speaks of raising up the temple. The Synoptics of rebuilding the temple. Raising up reminds us of the Lord's resurrection. John says rather strongly, you destroy this temple, whereas the Synoptics imply that it's Jesus who's going to destroy the temple. And John is sort of saying, your behaviour is going to have repercussions, and that will mean ultimately that the Romans will come and the temple will be destroyed. You are responsible, not me. And in John we read the afterthought from the beloved disciple. He was speaking of his temple, the temple of his body. Which implies, of course, now, doesn't it, that it's Jesus' body that's replaced the temple of the Jewish people. Interestingly, the setting at the beginning of that episode, it said it's the Passover of the Jews. So it's no longer our feast, it's their feast. And their feast, which is being replaced in Jesus. Father Michael Phelan, in his beautiful commentary, says this on page 95. If Jesus takes a whip to institutions as sacred as the temple and the Passover, what must he think of some of our traditions? Are we any less guilty of bottling the wine of God's Spirit in such a way as to make it inaccessible to those who are thirsting for it? So while it may seem as though it's speaking mainly about what Jesus replaces in Judaism, perhaps there is a strong sense of us too. Are we stopping people from reaching God? Once the temple is cleared, what does this mean for the Jewish people? We're going to see that with Nicodemus. And for the disciples of the Baptist, we're going to see that too. And then for the Samaritans, the wonderful chapter 4, the Samaritan woman. Just should add that this feast we celebrate, rather this gospel we celebrate, on the third Sunday in Lent of year B. It's a very important Sunday, because we're looking at how Jesus, in that Sunday, Jesus through his death and resurrection, is going to change things in a big way. And he's changing, of course, the Jewish institutions. So it's very important on that third Sunday of Lent in year B. The third thing we're going to look at today is Jesus and Nicodemus. Now, we know this story backwards. We know of being born again. In fact, we're often asked, have you been born again? It's sort of used very much by the fundamentalist peoples, and it's strong in our tradition. We'd all know of Nicodemus and the story of coming to Jesus by night. How are we to understand it now? How does the beloved disciple understand it? Well, the law